Nobel laureate James A. Robinson's work on inclusive and extractive government regimes has raised central questions across the world on why some nations fail and others succeed.
You can't have an inclusive economy, which is ultimately where you'd like to go, at the whim, shall I say, of a dictatorship or an authoritarian government.
The co-winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics 2024 was in India last week for speaking tours organized by the Nobel Prize Committee and Tata Trusts.
I think India has this kind of refreshing control over its destiny.
In this conversation with ET's Executive Editor Sruthijith KK,
Mr. Robinson, is capitalism still the best form of economic organization that we know, optimized for wealth creation and prosperity?
he talks about why capitalism is a term he rarely uses.
It's not really a word that economists use. You'd never find capitalism in an economics textbook, interestingly enough.
Oversimplifications are ludicrous.
Well, I don't mind simple explanations, but I prefer correct, simple explanations. I've always found these geographical theories to be sort of ludicrous, actually.
Whether we are learning from increased connections and years of documentation.
I think humanity sort of learns slowly. I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill's famous remark that you can always rely on the United States to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option.
And why he thinks America's mad rush for productivity gains is an impending train wreck.
What's the thrust of artificial intelligence in the United States at the moment? Fire as many workers as possible. In some ways, many of the problems that we have at the moment in the United States have been caused by 50 years of that logic. And now we're getting the same logic on steroids. And nobody seems to think this through. I think you're going to see substantial improvements in productivity, but it's going to be extremely inequitable. This is a train wreck waiting to happen.
Listen on, it's Tuesday, the 11th of November. I'm Anirban Chaudhary. This is The Morning Brief.
Mr. Robinson, strong institutions need a strong state or strong governments. But strong governments also tend to turn authoritarian over time. Is that a flaw at the heart of democracy as an engine for prosperity?
Well, that's why I'd emphasize a lot the governance of the state. When we talk about, the necessity of inclusive political institutions, we emphasize both the strong state, as you're saying, but also the kind of, what the governance of that state. So that's why we emphasize very much a broad distribution of political power, in whose interest is the state going to work. And I think what history suggests is that, you can't have an inclusive economy, which is ultimately where you'd like to go, without, at the whim, shall I say, of a dictatorship or an authoritarian government. You need to have participation, you need to have accountability, you need people to be involved, because ultimately it's the mass of people who have an interest in an inclusive society.
But is there a tendency for strong governments to, for the quality of democracy to lower over time, or that's not necessarily the case?
I don't think so. I don't think that's the fact. In our book, The Narrow Corridor, we sort of emphasize that strong states and strong kind of participatory society sort of co-evolve, meaning, the state may become stronger and more powerful, but then society kind of reacts against that and they move together, in this dynamic we call the Red Queen effect. Like North Korea is an interesting example, actually. If you went back to North Korea in the 1960s, it looks very different than it does today. There was actually much more participation in the Communist Party, and it was only subsequently in the 1970s that this very personalized kind of project captured the Communist Party in North Korea and basically swung it in the way it is now. So that would be an interesting example of what you're talking about.
Why nations fail, your magisterial sweeping look at history, and why it came out in 2011. It's been almost 14 years since then. It's been an action-packed 14 years. We've had a major global pandemic. We've had the rise of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence. Has anything happened in the last 14 years that has caused you to in any way modify your thesis at all?
The world's always more complicated than an argument such as the one we propose in Why Nations Fail. I think the job of the world is very complicated. Everybody knows it's very complicated. So I think the role of social scientists is to try to make it simpler and try to help people, see what's common, between all these very disparate phenomena. So, but of course, to do that, to simplify, you have to abstract from a lot of things. If you wanted me to talk about, what's going on in the United States at the moment, it's hard to do that without thinking about ideology, actually. Of a kind of the crisis of liberal ideology in the liberal state. If you wanted me to talk about China, to what extent might we have got the predictions about China wrong? I think that would be about Chinese culture, actually. It would be about, the culture of China and how that kind of creates a very different relationship between the state and society. So I think there's things that we took out of there to try to make the arguments simpler. But, these things are difficult to talk about in a kind of systematic way, other than saying, oh, it's all very complicated and everything is different. Well, you don't learn much from that.
Right. The seductive power of a simple explanation, such as the one that has gained a lot of currency, that geography is destiny, or that, geography and weather and these factors play a disproportionate role in... is it sometimes frustrating for you as an academic economist to work with a lot of variables, but in popular discourse, like people tend to gravitate towards a simpler explanation?
Well, I don't mind simple explanations, but I prefer correct, simple explanations. I mean, there's degrees of correctness, but I've always found these geographical theories to be sort of ludicrous, actually. I mean, I just don't think that explains everything. But obviously, human beings are somehow drawn to these things. Like if you go back to these geographical explanations, it's in Herodotus. Right at the end of Herodotus' history, he quotes Cyrus the Great as basically saying, like a kind of soft lands make soft people. So the Persians decided to live in a hard land, so they become a tough people.
Hardy people.
Yeah, so that's in Herodotus. It's interesting, that in humanity, these ideas keep resurfacing, despite the fact that I don't think they really explain anything. So, our theory is oversimplified, but I was trying to justify why simplification is useful. But some simplifications, are not useful at all, I don't think, as a way of thinking about things.
You discussed a little bit, you alluded to what's happening in the United States. With everything happening in the United States right now, do we have cause to believe that maybe it's easier to hijack or derail long-standing, robust institutions than we might have previously thought?
Well, I think in our work, in Why Nations Fail, we emphasize, you do have these huge reversals sort of historically. The lead example we have there is Venice, which was possibly the wealthiest place in the world in the late medieval period. And then it basically oligarchized and turned itself into an economic and commercial and political backwater. So, so it's happened in world history. Could it happen again? Of course it could happen again. I think one of the things, one of the big conclusions from our academic research is many of these ideas that social scientists are so wedded to, like this idea of kind of modernization, that everyone is sort of converging to this, the end of history. Francis Fukuyama sort of repackaged it as the end of history. If you look at history, you don't see anything like that actually whatsoever. I don't see convergence. I think the pattern is divergence. And, you have rise and fall of societies historically. And I think it's very hubristic, for us to think that, that couldn't happen to us. Because every society, the Venetians thought it couldn't happen to them either. The Romans thought it couldn't happen. The Athenians thought it couldn't, the Islamic world, the Umayyads, would never have imagined it could happen to them. So I think, like that's a bit of humility necessary there. I think, yes, it could certainly happen. I think, in Why Nations Fail, we outline the mechanisms, some of the mechanisms via which it could happen. I think in the case of the United States, it would be surprising, meaning we've been in this equilibrium for 230 years and the system has sort of revived itself when challenges have come. There's some challenges at the moment. Can it revive itself? Well, that has to be seen.
And it's fascinating, as you're saying, when we look back at the sweep of history. But I would argue that one thing that is different at this point, of course, is that we are more connected. We have more documentation. We have more, we know much more about history than arguably anybody else at any other point in history did. Not necessarily that, that makes us more insightful. But does that give us a chance to avoid some of the mistakes of the past or not necessarily?
Well, it makes some. Yeah, I think it helps to avoid mistakes of the past. I think humanity sort of learns slowly. I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill's famous remark that you can always rely on the United States to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. So I think history is a bit like that. We do the right thing after we've exhausted all the other options. But I also think, what you're describing makes things more difficult. If you look at, it's like Western European societies, how they democratize, for example, in this sort of slow, methodical way. You can't do that in the modern world. You can't like move, everyone is too well informed about the options and about what's going on in other societies, and people's demands are much more strident, and, they see what's possible. And, English voters didn't understand what was possible in 1900 or that puts a lot of pressure on governments to deliver and societies to change rapidly. And of course, the good news is it can happen. Look at South Korea. I mean, South Korea went from a completely impoverished country, almost within a generation, to this extraordinary technological and cultural wonderland.
Skincare wonderland.
Oh, I love that. K-pop,
K-beauty.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's fantastic. It's a cultural phenomenon also.
You're absolutely right. Even up until, say, 20 years ago, this would be so difficult to imagine that South Korea would be a global powerhouse of entertainment and, beauty. And
incredible. In 1970, the third largest export was human hair. People went around collecting human hair, which they would then sell to make wigs and export. That was the third largest export industry after plywood and apparel. There was no precedent for this. Also, it was created out of nothing. That's what's so exciting about it.
Many people argue that globalization is on the retreat around the world with the rise of sort of protectionist and nationalistic politics. One, do you believe that to be the case? And number two, if so, what is the next world order? Like, what is the shape of the coming world order?
I don't know if globalization is going to be on a retreat generally. I think it's pretty clear that the United States is kind of disentangling itself from globalization for obvious reasons, which is most Americans did not benefit from globalization over the past 50 years. The average wages of people without a college degree have fallen in the last 50 years, and that's the majority of people in the United States. So globalization might have created a huge amount of wealth in the United States and elsewhere in the world and pulled, millions of people out of poverty in India. But the average American hasn't benefited. So I think that's the simple sort of politics of it. So I think the United States is definitely withdrawing from globalization, that somehow the domestic political economy of the United States is not really consistent with that model anymore. What about the rest of the world? Well, the rest of the world could move on. Think about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was never engaged in the world economy. But the world globalization dramatically increased in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. The World Trade Organization was started and all sorts of international agreements took place without the Soviet Union. So I think the world can move forward without everybody taking part in it. But you can move on. There's huge amount of scope in the world. I mean, think about it like this. In 2100, 40% of all the world population will be Africans. Those people are desperately poor. There's just wild inefficiency, low levels of product. There's so much potential in Africa. If Africa can get its act together economically, it's just going to be the basis for decades and decades of economic growth. And, it can engage with India, it can engage with China, it'll be a whole different model.
Is capitalism still the best form of economic organization that we know, optimized for wealth creation and prosperity?
Yeah, capitalism is not really a word that I use, actually. It's not really a word that economists use. You'd never find capitalism in an economics textbook, interestingly enough. I don't really think about capitalism. I think, about institutions, about inclusive institutions. You could tell me about markets. Okay, is having markets, is that capitalism? Well, it depends on who has access to those markets, who has the kind of capabilities, as Amartya Sen would have said, to take part in those markets. I would talk about an inclusive economy. Maybe markets can be part of that, but how those market works needs to be sort of interrogated. I think it's sort of obvious that let's take the case of China or India, that acceleration in economic growth in China in the late 1970s or in India in the 1990s comes by moving towards a more kind of market-based integration with the world. The withdrawal of the Chinese state from the economy is just about creating incentives for people, creating opportunities for people, stop trying to control people. When I first came to India in 1985, I remember vividly getting off the plane in New Delhi. We went into this enormous sort of aircraft hangar. I had to open my suitcase, and the gentleman, we sat there for a couple of hours while he made a list of every single thing in my suitcase, all my socks and my toothbrush and and then when I left India, we had to go through the whole thing again and make sure I hadn't left any socks in India and make sure I hadn't left my camera in India and this sort of micromanaging society, just like that. But is that, I don't think about that in terms of capitalism. I find that where, one of the reasons that Professor Acemoglu and I kind of try to develop this language of inclusive and extractive institutions is that, the way to think about the difference between North and South Korea is not that North Korea is socialist and South Korea is capitalist. I don't think.
One is more inclusive and the other is more extractive.
Yeah, that's what we were trying to do.
Framework, yeah.
So I'm sticking to it. Yeah.
Right. No, what I meant is that capitalism as more commonly understood, which is that it is free markets, limited role of state, broadly sort of an equal footing for people to broadly equal. More or less equal access to opportunities and so on. Societies with those characteristics have generally been created more wealth, more prosperity.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
And that you would say is still a very good recipe for societies to follow.
Well, I don't know about that. Think about a feature of capitalism, you could say, is that, capital hires labor. But, think about the consequences of that in the last 50 years in the United States. Substitute workers. What's the thrust of artificial intelligence in the United States at the moment? Fire as many workers as possible. Create self-driving cars, self-driving trucks. Let's fire all the people. Why is that? Because that's sort of coming from the structural logic of capitalism. But maybe that's just going to lead to social explosion in the years going ahead. Maybe we need a different model. Yes, I think I completely agree with you, those examples of India and China and the growth acceleration. I think we understand how that happened. Economists understand how that happened. But I think the world is changing in a way which may kind of destabilize that.
What do you make of India's long-term growth from the time, say, you landed in 1985? To now, especially in the context of the neighborhood and the region we are in. We are surrounded by states which have, to various degrees, faltered, failed, have had difficult times. Why is India kind of an island of stability and long-term economic growth in this region?
Well, I think one of the things, we try to look a little bit more at the history of India in our book, The Narrow Corridor. And I think, one thing I learned from that, our reading there is, India has this extremely deep history of sort of participation and democracy. If you go back to the time of the Buddha, what the historians think is that the Buddha was living in this extremely participatory democratic society. So that's a really interesting history. That's a sort of somehow a much deeper history of democracy and participation than you have in the Western world, for example. And one thing I find fascinating about India, I don't know the explanation for this, maybe you can explain it, but, I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think compared to Africa, India has done a much better job of sort of building some kind of nation state out of all these many different languages and identities. That's been really a struggle in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's an enormous political achievement there. Nevertheless, I think, there's a lot of problems also. That history brings a lot of problems. I mean, the whole caste system, for example, in our book, we quote, Mr. Ambedkar a lot about the way the caste system kind of holds back Indian society, and in many ways, but obviously economically, it's part of the way that India is still being held back. There's a lot of research going on at the moment, actually, in economics, quite a hot topic, what the consequences of the caste system are in India. And people still find propensity of people to kind of work together and cooperate together. But I think that can change. I'm not saying it takes hundreds of years. As we discussed earlier, things move very much faster in the modern world than they did historically. But I think, Indian society will change and adapt, and it'll be Indians that that do that. And I think the other thing about India, which I find very exciting, is this sense of like control and ownership. And, you know, one of the problems in Africa I find always is that, you know, Africans are so kind of disempowered by the way, you know, world institutions are organized. Whereas I think India has this kind of really sort of refreshing sort of control over its destiny, you know, and that I like a lot, yeah.
And you touched upon AI in the past. What do you reckon this insane march of AI, as we have witnessed it in a very short duration itself, what does it behold for societies? I mean, our society is going to have to think about and implement universal basic income schemes. How do you look at the march of AI?
You know, I don't think you have to be a genius to figure out that one of the consequences of this is going to be further downward pressure on wages. And, you know, you just see the kind of logic of technological change in the United States is all focused on substituting robots for, you know, this is what Mr. Musk wants to do now. He wants to turn Tesla into a kind of robot factory. He wants to just replace people with robots. What are those people going to do? You know, robots don't vote. You know, people vote. In some ways, many of the problems that we have at the moment in the United States have been caused by 50 years of that logic. And now we're getting the same logic on steroids. And nobody seems to think this through. I mean, that's what I find sort of astonishing. This is a train wreck waiting to happen, it seems to me. You know, there's going to be a big adjustment to this. And one of, you know, part of that adjustment has to be, you know, how do you support people's incomes? And I think European societies have done a better job of this because they have mechanisms of social insurance. You know, they have a welfare state. But somehow the logic of American capitalism, you know, is different from that. So I think you're going to see substantial improvements in productivity, but it's going to be extremely inequitable. I mean, me working in the global South, you know, I also see the consequences for world inequality. Where is all this investment in AI happening? It's happening in the rich countries. It's not happening in Nigeria or Democratic Republic of Congo or Colombia or, you know, that's also, I find, pretty frightening.
We find today large parts of the world's population living in states where, you know, there's a kind of a trade-off. I mean, I'm referring to, say, China, many of the Middle Eastern monarchies, where the quality of life and your income is quite high, but you do not have, say, freedom of speech. The social and political life is not very participatory. But incredibly, even wealthy Westerners are, you know, gravitating towards, for tax reasons perhaps, they're very happy to live in, you know, these societies. Does that surprise you? And, you know, are we going to see more of these kind of states?
Well, you know, I think the success of the Gulf monarchies is sort of fascinating, you know, this sort of reinvention of this absolutist monarchy. My view about that is that at least, you know, European history and thousands of years of political philosophy suggests that absolutist monarchy is not a very sustainable model. You know, in fact, Sheikh Maktoum, you know, in Dubai has this wonderful remark about my grandfather rode a camel. You know this?
Yes.
Like, my grandfather rode a camel.
Yes.
And so I think he himself is very aware of the potentially transitory nature of this equilibrium. Now, of course, you know, what's unusual about those countries is this very strange mix of 10% of the people are citizens, or less than 10%, and 90%. So there's no kind of historical precedent for creating a society like that. And maybe that makes it stable in a surprising way. But I do think those societies are wildly understudied by social scientists. You know, it's really a remarkable, you know, I don't want to detract actually from the remarkable achievement in those countries. Yeah, because, you know, having worked in Africa for many, many years, you see how natural resource wealth can be squandered.
Mr. Robinson, congratulations once again on your incredible academic achievements and your Nobel Prize. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
That's it for today. This episode was produced by me, Vinay Joshi, and Rajas Naik, sound designed by Amrit Reggie. Listen to The Morning Brief every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.